Hello, welcome to the Tov channel. Thank you for joining. Our northeastern border, the Syrian border, is making headlines. Things are constantly happening there, and there's also the drama in the Druze arena in their battles against the Alawites. And this morning there was a report about aircraft. It turns out the situation is a bit more complicated than the brief report we received this morning. And precisely to elaborate on this topic, we have with us our beloved Middle East expert, Dr. Mordechai Kedar. So let's scan the Syrian arena a bit. What's happening there these days?
Look, these days what's happening is a very, very interesting development. Israel has come to the aid of the Druze. So it's true that it's hard to catch every jihadist who comes to kill Druze, but it's possible to persuade the government there to stop acting against the Druze, and that's why Israel sent aircraft to strike natural assets of the Julani regime, weapon bases, air defense, and things like that. In response to the Israeli activity in northern Syria, Turkish aircraft were scrambled to deter, to send a message, I don't know what else. But what happened was a very interesting development. In response to the Turkish aircraft, several Russian planes were scrambled from their base at Latakia in a place called Khmeimim. That means that all at once there were Israeli, Turkish, and Russian aircraft in the air, the Russians having coordinated with the Israelis. And that's a very interesting thing. Because apparently, or if my instincts are right, there is a division of roles. Israel is protecting the Druze, and the Russians are apparently protecting the Alawites, who live in western Syria in the area where the Russian forces are located. In the area called Al-Hamamim, and that's why this is very interesting, because suddenly it turns out that foreign countries like Israel and Russia are protecting the non-Muslim minorities in Syria who are facing the threat of extermination by Julani's gangs, whether those who are officially or unofficially, one way or another, under jihadist rule. Its roots are in Al-Qaeda and in ISIS, which currently controls Syria and looks very unfavorably upon both the Druze and the Alawites. This explains the terrible and horrific acts of violence that have been committed against these two communities in recent times. Therefore, it is very interesting that Israel in the south and Russia in the north are suddenly showing a presence and perhaps even an intention to act against the Syrian regime, which is acting against these communities in the Syrian region.
But there are so many forces, and now more outside forces are joining in with different interests. So maybe we need to clarify things again for our viewers. What exactly is happening there and who is backing whom?
So Syria is not a homogeneous country, but rather a heterogeneous one. There are 4 religions there. That is Muslims, Christians, Druze, Alawites, and I'm ignoring the remnants of Jews who are still there, if any remain. There are also 3 ethnic groups there. There are Turkmens, there are Arabs, and there are Kurds. You could also mention Armenians, Christians who are there, and even a small number of Circassians. There are various tribes as well. And of course, the central government tries to control all of them together and create a situation where there is one country, which is not the case. The Kurds, already about 10 years ago, declared their secession from Syria and established a state they call Rojava. This is what is called Western Kurdistan, meaning the part that is in Syria. These are the Kurds, and the Turks invaded Syria to make sure the Kurds do not establish a state for themselves. Because a Kurdish state in Syria could undermine internal stability in Turkey, since there are also Kurds there who might want to unite with their brothers in what used to be Syria and with those who now live in Rojava. And that's why Turkey has been intervening on the ground with military forces for quite a few years now. In response, the Americans stepped in and sent an expeditionary force to Syria, mainly to protect the Kurds from the Turks. So that's another force that needs to be taken into account. Meanwhile, this country was conquered by what is known as Julani or Ahmad al-Shara. The jihadist who hid for years in the Idlib region under Turkish protection, along with various jihadists who came to him from all over the world, Jordan, Tunisia, Algeria, as well as Chechens and even Uyghurs from China who arrived there, all of whom became what is known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that same organization for liberation there. There refers to Greater Western Syria, including Israel. And in an incredible move, last November and December, they managed to take over the country, and now they have under their control a multitude of infidels. And as they see them, and God also disbelieves as they see them, because the jihadists are aiming their knives precisely at the necks of these communities, the Druze and the Alawites, in order to literally separate their heads from their shoulders. Therefore, they now need to rely on someone who will guarantee their freedom and the safety of their bodies and minds. Traditionally, the Druze have turned to Israel, and that's understandable because there are many Druze in Israel, and some of them are connected through marriage ties with groups inside Syria. Therefore, it is possible and necessary to refer to them as our Druze brethren who live in Syria, and that's how I speak in the Arab media. When I'm asked all sorts of questions, I say our Druze brethren who live in Syria or Syrian citizens.
The headline of the first conversation is actually that despite the understanding that Putin has criticized Israel on various platforms in recent years, there is a behind-the-scenes strategic relationship between Israel and Russia, which is very significant. In my opinion, that's the headline of this conversation.
Yes, for example, Israeli aircraft operating in Syrian territory against the Julani army, in order to deter and warn them, if you don't protect the Druze, this is what will happen to you. So, in response to the Israeli aircraft, several Turkish planes were scrambled, but in response to the Turkish planes, several Russian aircraft were scrambled from the Khmeimim air base near Latakia. So in the air at the same time, there were apparently several Israeli planes, as well as Turkish and Russian ones. The Israelis are protecting the Druze, the Russians are apparently protecting the Alawites, and the Turks, well, both sides, one is Tarifa and the other is Nevla. So in this matter, things get complicated. Today, the situation is very complex, but it turns out that Israel has some sort of agreement with Russia on this issue, and this is something we haven't seen in the media until now. Apparently, it's some kind of secret bilateral agreement between Israel and Russia in order to maintain one way or another the Russian presence inside Syria.
So I'm putting forward a theory of my own here. Of course, I'm not much of an expert on the region, but tell me what you think, that this is actually related to the fact that Assad is in Moscow and is being protected there, and maybe the Russians, in a certain sense, are protecting the Alawites because from their perspective, the door for Assad to return to Syria still hasn't closed.
Look, Syria today is suffering from a lack of governance. The Kurdish region is controlled by the Kurds. The south is under Israeli control. In the west, perhaps Russia is in control there in one way or another, mainly in the air. In the east, there are tribes in the Deir ez-Zor area that the regime doesn't get along with. This country is, in practice, dismantled, and so it should be understood that in reality, this country is not functioning. Therefore, we really need to understand this thoroughly, because all kinds of different forces can potentially emerge from the chaos, some of them more positive, some less so, and we need to be fully prepared for every possible scenario that might arise. And if we prepare ourselves for every scenario, historically, it's much better to do this outside of Israel, especially after what we saw in October. But here it's important to warn about something very, very significant. Ahmad Sarraj, the president of the Syrian state official for the day, is doing everything he can to present himself as an ordinary, respectable person. Even though he grew up in Al-Qaeda and even had an affair with ISIS, spent about 8 years in an American prison in Iraq, and there was a $10 million bounty on his head, not because he parked illegally or anything like that. Okay? The man was a butcher. And that's why Israel and the forces on the battlefield are very cautious of him, especially after October 7th and the great deception we suffered from Hamas. Julani is Sinwar on steroids. That's how you need to understand this situation. And we must be very wary of all kinds of people who say, oh, he's willing to recognize Israel and join the Abraham Accords. He says that, but I don't believe a single word he says. Because according to Islamic tradition, on the sword of Hudaybiyah, meaning war, is deception. In other words, what he is doing is deception until proven otherwise. Therefore, from this very respectable platform of Channel Tov, I call on all Israelis who fantasize about eating hummus in Damascus through an agreement with Julani, drop it as soon as possible. Because in my opinion, he is fooling the whole world in order to get investments and reconstruction, and from us he wants legitimacy and a ticket to Washington. That's how he sees us, and therefore we really need to be careful with this person. For example, if he wants peace with Israel, let him recognize the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, leave us the Golan, and recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. If he is willing to do all these things, I am willing to reconsider what I am saying. As long as he does not recognize the state of Israel as the state of the Jewish people, both democratic and Jewish, as long as he is not willing to accept Jerusalem as the sole capital of Israel, and as long as he talks about Palestine needing to return to Islamic or Arab control, then I am not willing to talk to him at all. The day he changes his tune, maybe he can write to us and we'll see what we do.
Moti, I can't resist. I also wanted to talk to you a bit about the relationship between Turkey and Russia. Maybe we'll come back to that towards the end, but if I remember correctly, in conversations we had here on the channel with you a few months ago, you had sources inside Syria, and you were optimistic about managing a relationship with this terrorist organization.
No, in the Idlib area, there were also other organizations, liberal, modernist, not necessarily Islamic, because there are also Christians there. That's why I was in contact with them, not with Julani. Julani won't write to me and he won't respond to me, even if I approach him through Iman or Ikt. On the other hand, the Christians who live there, even the one I spoke with in the media, Fadel Masri, he is a hostage, so I can talk to him, talk about him. He is definitely someone you could sit with and settle matters. However, he is liberal, modern, and the number of people belonging to his division is apparently very small. Therefore, his actual ability to influence the jihadists is minimal at best. So, you can definitely talk with these people. The only question is how much influence they have, and it isn't much.
So let's wrap up this section with the question of Russia and Turkey. Let's try to understand the relationship between these two powers, because if the Russians have now actually launched planes from there, does that mean there's some kind of wedge between them? Or is it just a specific issue right now and we shouldn't get too worked up about it?
Look, everything, the real things, happen behind the scenes, and I don't know what's going on behind the scenes between Putin and Erdogan. In any case, there isn't any great love there. Erdogan is always flexing his muscles at the Russians and closing the Bosphorus Straits on them with all sorts of excuses. From the Russians' perspective, this isn't good because it traps them in the Black Sea and prevents them from reaching open waters, the Mediterranean and the oceans. And that's why Erdogan's behavior really doesn't sit well with Putin. On the other hand, don't forget that Putin, as a strong leader, always wants to see a strong leader on the other side, someone who isn't an opposition figure, someone who makes decisions on his own, and someone who also carries out his decisions without taking into account all sorts of intellectuals and progressives. That's how Putin is, that's how Erdogan is. Their style of control is quite similar, and that's the basis for their rapprochement and the special relationship they have with each other. However, when the Turks send up aircraft that threaten either the Druze or the Israelis or both together, the Russians really don't like it, and they also come out against the intention of the Turks to support groups like Julani and so on. So the Russians here are also playing a very interesting role.
I want to move on to another topic, still staying within the Syrian arena, but focusing more on our immediate interests. What we've been seeing in recent days with the Druze, the unrest in the north, the war that's developing there between them and the jihadist forces. Can you describe for us where things stand now, what this arena looks like?
The question is, on which day are you asking? Because the situation in the Syrian arena changes almost daily. There are so many currents inside, so many forces pulling in different directions. Even the rule of Sarah is not made from a single fabric or a single source. There are Syrians there, and there are Jordanians, and there are Algerians, and there are Chechens, and even one Uyghur to whom they owe a great deal because he was a chief ritual slaughterer. That's why it's very important to follow the developments closely. I'm telling you this as someone who does exactly that. Day by day, you read different things, different statements, what various people are declaring, where the government is heading. One moment it's with the Druze, another moment it's against the Druze. Sometimes it's with the Alawites, sometimes against the Alawites. Sometimes they're willing to reach out in peace to the Kurds, and other times they threaten them in a terrible and frightening way. In short, it's chaos and confusion, and whatever I say today is true for today. Tomorrow, things will already be different in Syria. That's why I recommend everyone learn Arabic and read the Syrian press every single day. And pay attention, Arabic is a very easy language to learn. So I am more than certain that each of you can learn Arabic, should learn Arabic in order to understand what's happening around us.
Thank you very much, Moti Kedar. Thank you for your words. And I hope that you all learned and gained insight at least as much as I did. I really want to thank you for your time and your tremendous support. Please share this broadcast, give it a like, subscribe to all our various channels, and of course, anyone who can support us. We need your support so we can continue to hold conversations like this with Dr. Mordechai Kedar and many others.